Hey everyone, what is hip? What is happening? Why am I trying to sound cool? I must stop that immediately. I wanted to talk a little bit about digital movie purchases and by extension streaming services and their quality because I recently bought an Apple TV 4K. And I am not an Apple fan. I do not like Macs. I do not like their software by any means, but I'd heard really good things about the video quality on their movies. If you buy a movie on iTunes, especially in 4K, you get a very high caliber of image. And as someone who wants to collect movies, as someone who wants to sort of keep pushing forward, and as someone whose Blu-rays have notably in the last year had some deaths. I've had some discs die to disc rot that wouldn't play past a certain point in the movie, making my Blu-ray collection feel like it's not long for this world. I really wanted to have a nice digital alternative because as much as by far the absolute best place quality wise is going to be 4K Blu-rays because you're going to get a much higher bitrate on a movie on a disc because you have way much more data to play with. You're not streaming it over the internet. Ultimately, I didn't want to commit to another physical format, partly because clearly they can die at some point. Not all of them will, but some will. I was not satisfied with some of the video quality that I had seen on various streaming services. Even 4K did not feel like a special jump in most cases. 1080p streaming quality, also wildly variable. I watched a movie on Netflix the other night called Stowaway, which was only available in HD, which is fine because 1080p can still look great. There's nothing wrong. 1080p as a baseline is wonderful, but the bitrate was so abysmally bad that I was seeing blobs of pixels on the back of heads, even just on the half of the face that was in shadow if it wasn't like super brightly lit. It was a movie set in space, so every time it cut to a shot of space, I could just see pixels moving around. It was horrendous. It did not feel like a service that I had paid for. I expect better from Tubi, which is a free streaming service. Netflix video quality for HD is absolutely garbage these days. It has gotten worse. They definitely have lowered it over time, and it is worth mentioning before I give you some numbers here, some bitrate numbers. Now, what is a bitrate? A bitrate is just the amount of data that the video and audio gets per second to make up the image, and of course the audio track. And the higher it is, the higher quality it is because when you have a low bit rate, you get pixelization, you get banding, which is like rows of pixels in the dark, you get blobs of pixels around things where there's like the light kind of goes away. It's very distracting. I would say that I prefer a 1080p Blu-ray over most of the 4K streaming you get from Amazon or Netflix for the most part. So in my search for a good 4K digital home, I didn't need it to be a streaming service. I actually quite like buying movies so that I have a library of curated films where I can always access the movies I want. I hate living by the attitude if it's not on a streaming service, it doesn't exist and I can't watch it. I cannot subscribe to that mentality and I never will. So I'd heard iTunes had the best quality. And I tried a few movies on iTunes through the Apple TV app on a Fire Stick 4K and thought it looked better than some of the other services, but I wasn't like blown away. I wasn't like seeing this next generation of quality. It turned out after a little bit of research that the bit rates on a non-Apple device, that the bit rates are actually capped much lower. If you're watching a movie you've bought on iTunes through Apple TV app on a Fire Stick, on a video game console, it is lower. It works out to be about average of usually around 10 with a peak of 17 meg per second. That is not the worst, but it's not really that impressive either. Upon learning this, I kind of just bit the bullet. I wanted to sort of feel good about my movie collecting going forward. I didn't really want to collect discs anymore, and I wasn't really satisfied with the quality that was being delivered from any of the streaming services for the most part. And even when there's one that I do think is a bit better than the others, I think Disney Plus, their quality tends to be quite solid versus the other streaming services. Ultimately, there's only so many things that are on Disney Plus. I want a lot of other movies that don't exist on Disney Plus. I got an Apple TV 4K. I looked at some of the movies that I'd already purchased on there in 4K. I was actually rather blown away by the quality of some of them. It's a fresh remaster, admittedly, but Total Recall in 4K from iTunes looks absolutely wonderful. The image is very pleasing. It maintains, the high quality grain structure of a movie that's shot on film. It doesn't cause pixelization, it doesn't cause any of those things. It looks really good. And I was seeing more detail in Total Recall. Die Hard in 4K definitely looks better than my Blu-ray. There was definitely a few other ones as well, and I've enjoyed buying some cheap movies again on 4K on there when they're on sale and seeing what they look like. Some are a significant jump, some are only a little bit better. If they've not remastered, if they've not put the time in, the effort with a new transfer or whatever. But some of them, like Predator, looks wonderfully natural with all the grain intact, unlike that horrible Blu-ray where it was all digitally scrubbed out. So I'm going to give you just a couple of numbers to compare things to other services. So this is a little bit more technical. This might be a little bit less interesting if you're not into this. This is coming from Blu-ray.com, these particular numbers. So I'm going to give you a set of results for Avengers Endgame in 4K. And then I'm also going to give you a set of results for another movie that I unfortunately didn't recognize. It's an animated film, but the user never mentioned what it was. But this is from a user by the name of Samlop10 on Blu-ray.com's forums, which is in in particular the iTunes digital movie section. On iTunes, it was averaging 25 meg per second in the video and peaking at 31. Movies Anywhere, which is not available in a lot of the world, averaged also at 25, but peaked at 32. So it peaked slightly higher, but not a huge difference. So that's those. Disney Plus, on the other hand, averaged at 17, peaked at 29. So you can see kind of a discrepancy kind of starting to form here. Netflix averaged at 17 and peaked at 25. Vudu, which is again not available in a lot of the world, averaged at 14 and peaked at 17. So that's particularly bad. And then Amazon Prime, coming in last out of the ones tested here, with an average of 10 and peaking at 13. So the peak bitrate for 4K Amazon Prime, at least on Avengers Endgame, was less than half of the average on the ones coming up at the top, on the high end. So that's particularly notable. And maybe shows kind of the range that you're going to get with the image quality here. So, and it is worth mentioning, yes, the 4K Blu-ray disc is going to be better. A 4K Blu-ray disc can have average bit rates from anything from the 40s all the way up to over 100 per second. But 4K Blu-ray disc costs a lot of money. I get movies on sale on iTunes for £3 or £4. It's a very different thing, and you also get upgrades to 4K if you already have the HD version of a movie. In most cases, there's some caveats to that occasionally, but that is worth mentioning. So that is the 4K numbers on Avengers Endgame, and I can say just from like corroborating this with other places and other research that averaging 25 and peaking at 31 is a very, very common set of numbers for the movies on iTunes. Some, like I said earlier, are a little bit lower, with maybe more like 15 to 24, but that's still fairly respectable, all things considered, and it's a very pleasing overall quality. I've been very happy with watching movies that way. But I was curious, one of the things that I have not been able to corroborate this with anywhere else, it's the same user, Samlop10, on the same thread over on Blu-ray.com, but they did a test on this animated film that I mentioned, which is only in 1080p. Because I was curious, how do they fare in 1080p? In particular, this is kind of what prompted this video, is I had such a bad time watching Stowaway on Netflix the other night that I wanted to know what the 1080p bit rates were between the services and between these storefronts to see like how much worse it was compared to these other. And also because I wanted to know, is it worth me buying 1080p movies on iTunes for stuff that doesn't have 4K or I never got on Blu-ray? Is it worth me picking up, for example, the Critters movies? Because I think there's a Blu-ray now, but there wasn't a Blu-ray when I was heavily buying them. And I'm going to need to watch them at some point for streams. So here was the results. iTunes came out on top with an average bitrate of 10 meg and a peak of 15. Movies Anywhere came in at 8 average with a peak of 10. So you can see it's a bit lower than the iTunes. Fair bit in some ways. Disney Plus came in at an average of 7 with a peak of 11. Amazon Prime came in with an average of 5, but with a peak of 14. So the peak's much higher, but the average is obviously hovering. It's obviously hovering closer to that 5, a lot more. Amazon, I think, tends to be okay for 1080 streaming, if not exceptional. But I don't tend to find myself being disgusted by it. So maybe that's kind of the baseline for what they should have. Like any lower than that, it's where I start to worry. Vudu came in at an average of 4 with a peak of 5. That is a very narrow margin and not a lot of room to spike. And then coming in last out of these ones that were tested for this particular movie on Netflix, Netflix came in with a peak of 13, which sounds not bad. It's actually the third highest peak on this list, but the average is 3 meg per second, meaning that if it hits 13 at some point, then it hits there a couple of times or some. I don't know. 3 is abysmally low for an average, and I believe it. Now, this is obviously one user on one forum. They did post a screenshot of where they got the data from the information on the screen. So there is some proof there. Not that I'm doubting the person, because why would they lie about this? But I believe it with my eyeballs, because what I saw on Netflix the other night watching Stowaway in 1080p was quite frankly embarrassing, and this is kind of what's prompted this. And I thought I've done so much kind of like looking into this and sort of made these choices about where I'm going to collect movies now, that I thought some people might be interested in why I made those choices and might be interested in this information to make their choices of their own. Now, obviously, this has been a very specific example. There's actually a wonderful Google Doc created by another user on Blu-ray.com. It goes by the name of Egans316. And I'll link this in the description, but this Google Doc has the bitrate information for hundreds of titles on iTunes. You can actually kind of see that there's two tiers of 4K. There's the 25 meg average with a 31 peak, and there's the 15-ish average with the 25 peak. Which is notably still better than many of the other streaming services. And then, of course, for HD, you have the upper tier, which is averaging 10, peaking at 15, with a lower tier, which is I'd say it's very common, but still notably on par with some of the other places, which is averaging 7 and peaking at about 11. There are a few rare cases. If you scroll down through the Google Doc, you will find the odd HD title that looks quite bad numbers-wise, where they'll average around 6 and peak at 7. And it looks a little bit tighter in terms of bitrate. But those are few and far between. So it's a wonderful resource. I'll link it in the description so you can have a look for yourself. Typically speaking, iTunes, and if you've got access to movies anywhere, they're up kind of high. Disney Plus is the best kind of underneath that is definitely above the other streaming services. Not quite as good as those, but pretty solid. Where Netflix for 1080 is just at the bottom of the barrel. And the numbers ultimately don't lie. There can be anomalies where the numbers don't matter because it just looks like shit for some reason. But by and large, the numbers don't lie, and they tell a simple story. So I thought people might be a little interested in just making choices. If you do buy digital movies, maybe to choose to buy them in one place over another. Maybe buy them on iTunes, say, versus Amazon, because Amazon makes it very easy to buy movies because it's your Amazon account. It's very easy to just click the button, but the quality is much better elsewhere. So I do not claim to be an expert on any of this. I understand it enough to know how it affects my viewing experience and have sought to rectify it the best I could. That's basically it. I I wanted to go through this. I wanted to sort of explain some of this just because I've mentioned it in a few places in the last week, and some people might find this useful. So hopefully some did, and it's helping with some choices. So thank you very much for joining me. You can, of course, like and subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. I do appreciate it, and it is the way that YouTube channels grow and gain success by those interactions. So please do. You can also support financially over at patreon.com/MailFuzzTV for as little as $1 per month. So please go and consider that and get some bonuses for your trouble. So thank you once again for joining me. Keep watching movies and hopefully watch them in high quality, because why would you want to ruin something like The Dark Knight by watching it as if it's like going through a potato? You don't want that. You don't want that. I'll see you next time.